everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then definitely subscribe. If my voice sounds a little bit croaky in this video, then I do apologise. I've currently got a bit of a cold. Don't worry, it's not anything serious, it's just a cold. But yeah, just thought I'd say, because I feel like my voice sounds really gross. Anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the case of Sarah Payne, and this case is a really heartbreaking one, but it's one that I've wanted to cover for a while because although it is so tragic and heartbreaking, something incredible did come from it. The family of the victim, the Payne family, have worked so hard over the years for a change in laws surrounding sex offenders. In England and Wales, we have what is known as Sarah's Law, which is a child sex offender disclosure scheme that was introduced as a result of this case. And I'll talk more about Sarah's Law and how it was created towards the end of the video, but first let me tell you Sarah's story. So this case took place in the year 2000 in the county of West Sussex in the south of England. And this is Sarah Payne. She was an 8-year-old girl born Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne on the 13th of October 1991. Her parents were called Michael and Sarah Payne, and Sarah was one of 4 siblings. She had 2 older brothers named Lee and Luke, who were 13 and 12 at the time of this case taking place. And she also had a younger sister named Charlotte, who was just 5 years old, so she was 3 years younger than Sarah. Michael and Sarah Payne did later have another child, another daughter named Ellie. However, she was born a couple of years after this case took place. Sarah's mother, Sarah, described her daughter as just being very much a girly girl. She loved wearing pretty dresses, she loved princesses and fairies and dolls. She had a huge imagination and she loved anything magical. And 8-year-old Sarah just adored her family so much. She had so much love for her parents and for her siblings, and she had this little, I guess, ritual or routine where every night before bedtime she would make sure she gave every family member a kiss goodnight. She was such an affectionate young girl. Now, the Payne family lived in Hersham, which is a village in Surrey. However, on Saturday the 1st of July 2000, they decided that they were going to travel to the seaside town of Kingston Gorse in West Sussex. It was due to be a hot and sunny weekend, and so the family wanted to spend it near the seaside with Michael Payne's parents, so Sarah's grandparents, Terence and Leslie, as they lived in West Sussex close to the beach. So they travelled to West Sussex on Saturday afternoon. The journey would have taken like just under an hour and a half, and when they arrived they all had dinner together. And after they finished their meal, Michael, Sarah, Michael's father Terry and all 4 of the children decided to walk to the beach. They were at the beach for a little while, they were all having a really nice time, and Michael and Sarah had agreed to go with Terry to his friend's house because his friend had been like renovating and doing up his home, so they wanted to go and see it. And they had planned to take all 4 children with them to see this house, but Lee, Luke, Sarah and Charlotte were all just having so much fun at the beach together that they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay, and so they asked their parents if they could stay and play for a bit longer at the beach. And Sarah and Michael were a bit apprehensive about letting the girls Sarah and Charlotte stay at the beach without them because they were only 8 and 5. You know, the boys Lee and Luke were 13 and 12, and so they were trusted to be on their own for a little while, but Sarah wasn't sure about leaving the girls with them because of their ages. But eventually she decided that she would let the girls have a little bit of freedom, and she said that they could stay with their brothers at the beach for a little while. Sarah told the girls that they were to do what Lee said because he was the oldest, and that all 4 of them had to stay together at all times. And if they wanted to walk back to their grandparents' house, then they could, because their grandmother Leslie was still there. She had stayed behind. So Michael and Sarah said goodbye to their children and they set off walking to Terry's friend's house. and that was the last time the two of them ever saw their daughter Sarah again. After having a look around the friend's house, the three adults stopped at the local pub for a drink, but they really weren't there for very long before deciding to head back home. However, when they began approaching the house, they noticed that Leslie, the grandmother, seemed to be quite frantic. She was holding little Charlotte's hand, and the boys Lee and Luke were next to her, but 8-year-old Sarah wasn't. And as soon as Leslie saw Terry, Michael and Sarah, she shouted to them, "Have you got Sarah?" And when they responded no, Leslie explained that she couldn't find her. Sarah had just disappeared. So immediately Sarah's parents were just sent into a panic, and the family began searching the whole area for Sarah. They were all shouting her name, hoping that maybe she had just gotten lost and that they would find her at any second. But they didn't. As they continued to search, the other three children began explaining to Michael and Sarah exactly what had happened, because of course the last time they saw all four of their children was at the beach. Sarah's older brothers, Lee and Luke, explained that all four of them soon got bored of playing at the beach, and so they decided to instead go and play in a cornfield which was very close to their grandparents' house. It was somewhere that the children would often play when they were staying with Terry and Les, because the corn was pretty high, so it was a good place to play like hide and seek. So they headed to the cornfield and they began playing, and at some point 8-year-old Sarah actually tripped and fell over and she hurt herself. It wasn't anything serious, she hadn't like seriously injured herself or anything like that, but when kids fall over or they trip, of course they do get a bit upset, and so Sarah decided that she wanted to go back to the house to see her grandma. So Sarah began running through the cornfield towards the lane in the direction of the house, and Lee, her brother, began running after his sister because he didn't want her to walk back on her own. So Lee was running after Sarah, and at one point he kind of stopped and he turned his head briefly, probably only for a couple of seconds, just to check his other siblings Luke and Charlotte were okay. And then when he turned back around, Sarah was gone. She had just vanished. So Lee immediately ran back to the house expecting Sarah to be there, but she wasn't, and that was when alarm bells started to ring. This really was not in Sarah's behaviour. She was actually a very cautious and timid young girl. She wasn't the type to just wander off on her own. She would actually get quite scared being on her own for too long, and so the family knew that they had to find her quickly. They continued searching for her. They were asking literally everyone, every stranger they passed, if they had seen a young girl wandering around, but no one had. And at this point it was beginning to get dark. It was the evening and Sarah was terrified of the dark, so her family knew that it was time to contact the police and report her as missing.
Emergency, Rich Service. Please, I've lost my daughter. Please, thank you.
Can I call you through the police emergency? What's the problem?
I've lost my 8-year-old daughter. She's been missing about an hour and 3/4 now.
Police arrived at the house literally within 10 minutes of that phone call being made, and immediately Sarah's disappearance was a very high priority case because she was a child. She was an 8-year-old girl. Officers asked the Payne family to talk them through the exact timeline of events. They wanted as much detail as possible about what had happened and the last time Sarah was seen. Meanwhile, they had helicopters with searchlights in the air looking for her and getting a better view of the area from above, trying to spot the little girl. They also began searching local rivers and ditches and culverts, all the obvious places that a child could have like fallen into or gotten stuck in. In the beginning of this investigation, detectives thought that it was very possible that Sarah could have just gotten lost. You've got to remember, this wasn't where she actually lived. She didn't live in West Sussex, she lived in Surrey. And yes, it was where her grandparents lived, but still she didn't know the area too well, so there was a good chance that she could have just wandered off and couldn't find her way back. But as time went on, this theory was looking less likely. It was looking more likely that Sarah Payne was probably abducted. As the search for Sarah continued, a couple of officers were still speaking to the Payne family. Like I said, they needed as much detail as possible, mainly from Sarah's siblings, about exactly what had happened before she vanished. The police kept telling the siblings, particularly Lee, as he was the one who was running after Sarah, that he needed to tell them every single detail, no matter how small he thought it was. And it was at this point that Lee remembered something that he had seen around the same time that Sarah ran out of the cornfield. Lee said that just after Sarah vanished, he had seen a large white van driving down Peak Lane, which was the lane that Sarah had disappeared from. And Lee actually remembered pretty well what the driver of this white van looked like, because as he was driving by, the man actually smiled and waved at Lee. So Lee said that the man driving this van was white, and he described him as scruffy looking. He also said that when he smiled, he noticed that he had discoloured gappy teeth. So now the police kind of had their first piece of evidence in this case, or their first actual lead. This man was driving down the road that Sarah vanished on at exactly the same time that she vanished, and Lee got a good look at this man, a man that police now theorised could have been Sarah Payne's abductor. At around 1 AM, so the early hours of the next morning, the search for Sarah had to be called off because it was just too dark and everyone needed to rest so that they could resume the search in the morning. Although, as I'm sure you can imagine, Sarah's parents and her grandparents didn't sleep at all that night because they were just so sick with worry. The search continued the next day for Sarah, but soon 24 hours had passed since she was last seen, and this was very worrying. You know, she was an 8-year-old girl who would not be able to survive on her own for very long if she had just gotten lost. With every hour that passed, the police were getting more and more worried that instead of finding her alive, they would find her body. But Sarah's family were not giving up hope. They were determined to bring her home safe and well, particularly her mother Sarah. She would not let herself believe that her baby girl was dead. She was just so fixed on getting her home with her family. Meanwhile, as the officers and volunteers carried on looking for Sarah, other detectives began looking into known sex offenders in the area. And there was one man in particular that caught the attention of the police. They actually had their first suspect pretty soon in this case. His name was Roy Whiting. He was a 41-year-old man who lived in a flat in the town of Littlehampton in West Sussex. He worked as a car mechanic and his name was on the sex offenders register. Roy was on the register because in the year 1995, he abducted and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl in Crawley in West Sussex. He was driving around the area when he spotted this young girl, and he literally just grabbed her and forced her into his car. He then drove her to a nearby wooded area, and there he assaulted her before literally just dropping her home. I mean, you can't even imagine how terrified this poor girl must have been. Roy was arrested for this crime and he admitted to it, and for this, for sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl, he received a 4-year prison sentence. However, he only served 2 years and 5 months of this 4-year sentence before being let out, despite a psychiatrist saying that he was very likely to reoffend and assault another child if he was released. But still, he was released anyway, and when he was placed on the sex offenders register. And then fast forward a couple of years later, 8-year-old Sarah Payne disappears from around the same area where Roy Whiting lived, and so the police decided that they needed to speak to this man. So detectives questioned Whiting and they asked him where he was on the evening that Sarah vanished, and he said that he was actually nowhere near the area. He said that he was in the Brighton and Hove area that day, on his own at a fun fair, which I mean straight away concerned the police that this known paedophile was on his own at a children's fun fair. Why was he there? It was really weird, but at this point they didn't have anything to link him to Sarah Payne, and he said that he didn't even own a white van, and police believed that their main suspect owned a white van because that was what Sarah's brother Lee saw on the road at the same time that Sarah went missing. Nevertheless, they were still a little bit suspicious of this man because he just seemed to be quite nervous when they questioned him, so they decided to just keep an eye on him for the time being. Anyway, detectives left Roy's flat where they questioned him, and they went and sat in their car, and they were sat in there for a couple of minutes when all of a sudden Roy Whiting walks out of his flat and gets into a white van. A van that he said he didn't own. He had lied about owning a white van, which detectives later found out he had purchased, I believe, just a couple of days before Sarah Payne disappeared. Anyway, he came out of his flat, he opened the door to his van, and as he did, the detectives noticed that a piece of paper had fallen out of the vehicle and landed on the ground. So detectives got straight out of their car and they went to pick up this bit of paper, and they quickly realised that it was a receipt. Now, this receipt was from a petrol station, I believe near Pulborough in West Sussex, and it was dated the evening of Saturday the 1st of July, the same day that Sarah Payne went missing.
The receipt clearly shows that he lied, because the A24 is several miles north of the A27, it's going towards Crawley, and it's nowhere near Hove. So that small receipt falling out of the door as the officers stepped up to question him again, the second time they'd spoken to him, showed, one, he lied about where he was on Saturday night, and two, that he'd been in a different location to where he said he was.
It was just so suspicious. His behaviour was just so suspicious, and so even though they didn't have any concrete evidence linking him to Sarah Payne, they still decided to arrest 41-year-old Roy Whiting on suspicion of abduction. He was taken in for questioning, but nothing really came from this. This man was keeping very quiet, and every single question he was asked, he just responded with no comment. And like I said, they had no solid evidence that he had anything to do with Sarah's disappearance. They didn't even know at this point whether Sarah was dead or alive, and so they had to let Whiting go, but they kept a very close eye on him. And according to one source, after he was released, Whiting was actually spotted just hanging around and lurking around a local swimming pool. I don't believe he was even swimming himself. He was literally just watching the people in the pool, and I'm guessing a lot of them were children in their swimming costumes. And so the police decided to put him under 24-hour surveillance so that they could literally monitor everything he did. Around 2 to 3 days after Sarah was last seen, her parents Michael and Sarah decided to do a press conference in which they begged for Sarah's safe return.
We need a home now, today, as quickly as we possibly can. She's our life.
Publicity was crucial in this case. The more Sarah's face was on the news, the more people knew to look out for this little girl, and the better chance they had of finding her. And following the press conference, the police were receiving thousands and thousands of calls from the public with possible tips and leads, and they even had several reported sightings of Sarah Payne, but none of them were confirmed to have been her. Michael and Sarah Payne did a press conference, I believe pretty much every day during the search for Sarah, because they wanted to keep her case in the news. They wanted to keep her case in people's minds because they were desperate to get her home. And in every single one of these press conferences, Sarah Payne looked down the camera and she spoke directly to her 8-year-old daughter, and she told her that they were going to find her.
Sarah, if you're watching, Mommy loves you. And we miss you. And we're looking for you, darling, and we're going to find you. Okay? We're going to find you.
It was very important to Sarah to do that, to talk directly to her daughter, just in case she was watching. If Sarah was alive and she was somehow watching those press conferences, Sarah wanted to reassure her little girl that they were going to bring her home. Sarah also packed a bag for her daughter, just in case the police found her. She packed a bag with some clothes, she packed a book that Sarah had been reading just before she vanished, and also her teddy, so that she could take it to her daughter straight away when they found her. Every day the search for Sarah Payne intensified. They had hundreds and hundreds of police officers assigned to the case. They also had so many volunteers as well. So many people came forward to help with the search. Police were conducting underwater searches of local rivers. They were using helicopters to scan the local areas from above. They were doing everything they possibly could to find Sarah Payne. But sadly, just over 2 weeks after Sarah went missing, her family received the worst possible news, news that they had been dreading. A little girl's body had been found and the police believed it was Sarah. On the morning of the 17th of July 2000, so 17 days after Sarah was last seen, a farm worker came across the body in a field in Pulborough, about 15 miles away from Kingston Gorse, where Sarah vanished. And it was clear that someone had attempted to bury this body. Although the grave was pretty shallow, it had been disturbed, I think, by animals, which is how the farmer found it. And as I said, the police were pretty certain that this was the body of Sarah, because she was the only young girl in the area that was missing at the time. But of course they can't identify her for certain until they have confirmed it through DNA. So the body was taken for a post-mortem, and soon enough it was identified as being 8-year-old Sarah Payne. Now, when Sarah Payne was told the news that the body was confirmed through DNA to be her daughter, I think that she knew it was true. She knew that it had to be true, but at the same time there was a tiny part of her that couldn't quite believe it until she had seen the body with her own eyes. She wanted to confirm herself that it was her baby girl. She really wanted to see her daughter's body, but the family liaison officers just thought it would be way too traumatic for her. It's believed that Sarah's body had been in that field probably since the day she vanished. So she was killed and buried the same day that she disappeared. So her body was very badly decomposed. She had been exposed to the elements, animals had gotten to her. It just would have been way too distressing for Sarah to see her daughter in that way, and the family liaison officers didn't want that to be the last memory she had of her daughter. It was a really difficult decision for Sarah to make, but ultimately she decided not to go and see her daughter's body, which I think was definitely the right decision. I don't think any mother, any parent should ever have to see their child in that way. It would have just been so traumatic. Sarah's post-mortem concluded that her cause of death was from asphyxiation, caused by either strangulation, suffocation, or a combination of both. They couldn't tell for certain exactly how she died because of how badly decomposed her body was. They could tell from the post-mortem that Sarah hadn't been raped, but they couldn't confirm that she hadn't been sexually assaulted at all. But she was found naked, so it does indicate that this crime was sexually motivated. So it was clear from her autopsy that they were dealing with a homicide. What was previously a missing persons investigation was now a murder inquiry, and the police were looking for a child killer. And so they turned to the public, urging anyone with any information regarding Sarah's murder and her killer to come forward. And once again, the police began receiving numerous calls with potential tips and leads. But there was one in particular that proved to be crucial in this investigation. A woman named Deborah came forward to the police after Sarah's body was discovered, and she said that about 2 days after Sarah vanished from the cornfield, she actually saw a child's shoe in the middle of a road in Coolham, just 8 miles away from where Sarah's body was later found. Anyway, Deborah saw this child's shoe, and at first she didn't really think much of it. I believe there was a school close by, so I think she just assumed that one of the school children had dropped it or lost it. But then when she heard on the news 2 weeks later that Sarah Payne's body had been found, she decided that she should probably contact the police because the shoe was still there. Well, it was about 150 yards away from where it was first seen. I'm guessing like cars and maybe the wind had moved it. But anyway, the shoe was recovered and detectives took it in an evidence bag to Michael and Sarah Payne, and they asked them if they recognised the shoe. And they did. They said that this shoe was Sarah's. So the shoe was sent off for forensic testing. Now, the strap on Sarah's shoe was Velcro, and of course Velcro is a very, I was going to say sticky piece of material, but that's not the right word. Velcro can pick up a lot of substances. A lot of things can cling to it, and so detectives were hopeful that forensics may be able to find some sort of evidence on this Velcro, and there were hundreds of fibres on this shoe, all of which had to be literally picked off piece by piece. Normally when forensics try to get fibres from clothing, they use like sticky tape or sellotape to pick it up, but obviously with Velcro they couldn't do that. So like I said, they were literally picking off every fibre using forceps, so it was going to take some time. Meanwhile, as they were doing this, police were still monitoring 41-year-old Roy Whiting because he was still a person of interest in this case. I mean, he was pretty much their main suspect, but at this point they still couldn't charge him with anything, so he was just on 24-hour surveillance. And the public actually knew that Whiting was a person of interest in the Sarah Payne case. I'm not sure how they knew. I'm guessing it got leaked to the media somehow, but they knew, they somehow found out, and the public were outraged and people started coming for him. At the time that people found out, he was staying with his father in his house, and people would stand outside the house and scream and shout at him. They would throw bricks at the house and smash the windows. And so Whiting decided to leave his father's house, and instead he went to go and live in a tent in Crawley, not far from where he had abducted and sexually assaulted that other young girl years before in 1995. He was trying to hide from everyone, the public, the press and the police. But he knew he couldn't hide for long in that area, and so he decided to go on the run. Well, he tried to go on the run. In the early hours of the morning on the 23rd of July 2000, so just under a week after Sarah Payne's body was discovered, Roy Whiting decided to steal a car and make a run for it. But of course, because he was under surveillance, police were monitoring him constantly, so they knew what he was doing. Whiting stole a car and he began driving at high speed, and the police were behind him, chasing him. So he was driving faster and faster, and at one point he was actually driving like down a road the wrong way. Eventually he was driving so fast that he crashed into another parked car. I honestly don't know how he thought he was going to get away with it, but anyway, he was arrested and charged for stealing a vehicle and for dangerous driving. And he was remanded in custody before being jailed for 22 months for this crime. And this was honestly a blessing for the detectives investigating Sarah Payne's murder, because he was their main suspect in her death, and this meant he was off the streets and unable to harm another child whilst they worked on their case. The police were under a huge amount of pressure to convict someone for this horrific murder, because this case was massive. It had gained an enormous amount of media attention. Everyone just wanted the person who did this to Sarah to be brought to justice, and even the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, was getting in contact with the detectives asking for updates in this inquiry. That's how big this case was. The police were certain that they had the right guy. They were certain that Roy Whiting was Sarah's killer, but they needed solid evidence to prove it and to secure a conviction. So they went to search his white van, the one that he had purchased just days before Sarah disappeared. I believe they actually seized the van when Whiting first became a suspect in this case, and they searched it, and inside they found like some tools and some dirty clothes, but they also found other items in there that were pretty concerning. For example, he had some cable ties, a knife, a spade, some baby oil, all of which looked like they could have been part of an abduction kit. But still, there was nothing concrete linking him to Sarah Payne. But now they were forensically searching the van, hoping to find any evidence, and it was clear to the detectives that this man was actually very forensically aware. He had clearly attempted to clean the back of the van because he obviously knew about DNA and forensics. But thankfully, he didn't manage to wipe away all of the evidence that would be found in there. Inside this van, I believe on one of Whiting's sweatshirts, forensics found a 9-inch blonde hair, just one single strand, one single blonde hair. And when this strand was tested, it was found that it was highly, highly likely to have come from Sarah Payne. In fact, the chances of it not belonging to Sarah was 1 in a billion. It was Sarah Payne's hair. But that wasn't the only forensic evidence they found linking Roy Whiting to Sarah Payne. If you remember, forensic scientists had been collecting and examining the fibres from the Velcro strap on Sarah's shoe. Now, there were fibres on this shoe from Sarah's blue sweatshirt, which was what she had been wearing the day she was abducted, so they knew for definite that it was her shoe. But there were also some red fibres on the shoe that were found to have come from a red sweatshirt that was inside the van. Fibres from Roy Whiting's red sweatshirt was on Sarah Payne's shoe. As well as that, there was another fibre on the shoe that matched a pair of curtains that were recovered from the van. I also read in a book about this case that when Sarah's body was discovered, there were around 200 fibres found in her hair. Now, some of these fibres were from Whiting's red sweatshirt, and about 11 of them were from socks that were found inside his van. In addition to this, one of the fibres in her hair was a match to the passenger seat front cover in his vehicle. Okay, I know that was a lot of information to hear at once, but as you can gather, they now had a substantial amount of forensic evidence linking Roy Whiting to Sarah Payne. They had a strong case against him now, and so on the 6th of February 2001, he was arrested in his prison cell and he was charged with the kidnap and murder of 8-year-old Sarah Payne. But unsurprisingly, just like he had done throughout this whole case, Roy Whiting denied everything. Throughout all of his questionings, he just said no comment, and so it was no surprise when he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. His trial began in November of 2001, and the prosecution presented all of their evidence to the jury, including the forensic evidence, the receipt that fell out of Whiting's van that proved he was lying about where he was on the evening that Sarah disappeared. And Sarah's oldest brother, Lee, also gave evidence via a video link in which he described seeing Whiting in his van just after he abducted Sarah. If you remember, Whiting like smiled and waved at Lee just before driving off, so Lee got a good look at his face. The judge had ruled that the prosecution were not allowed to discuss the crime that Whiting had committed in 1995 when he sexually assaulted that other 9-year-old girl. That information was withheld from the jury as it was feared that it could jeopardize the trial, but ultimately all the evidence that was presented was enough to prove to the jury that this was the man responsible for the abduction and murder of Sarah Payne. And on the 12th of December 2001, Roy Whiting was found guilty. Before sentencing Whiting, the judge turned to him and said, quote, "You are and will remain an absolute menace to any little girl, and you are every parent's and grandparent's nightmare come true." He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 50 years, although I actually read on a couple of sources that in 2010, this minimum term of 50 years was actually reduced to 40 years. So he had 10 years taken off his sentence, which is insane. I have no idea why they would even consider reducing it, but anyway, it means that he will now become eligible for parole in 2041 when he is around 82 years old. Although, to be honest, even if he does make it to 82 years old, I think that it is very unlikely that he will ever be released. As you can expect, because he is a paedophile, he was targeted a lot by other inmates. In 2002, he was attacked with a razor whilst he went to get some hot water, and this was pretty severe. The injury left him with a 6-inch scar on his right cheek. In 2011, another inmate stabbed him in the eye, and in 2018 he was stabbed by 2 inmates in his cell and he had to be taken to hospital for treatment, but he survived the attack. So that is pretty much it for the case, but there was a lot that happened after Whiting was sent to jail that I wanted to mention. So after Sarah's death, her parents Michael and Sarah were determined that they were not going to let their daughter's death be in vain. They wanted something good to come from this horrible tragedy, and so Sarah began to do some research on the law surrounding sex offenders, because obviously, as we know, Roy Whiting had attacked another child before. Sarah was not his first victim. He had abducted and sexually assaulted another little girl in 1995, but he was just released a couple of years later, despite a psychiatrist saying that he was very likely to reoffend. He was just free to do it again, and he did do it again, but this time he murdered a little girl as well. He was put on the sex offenders register after he was released, but Sarah Payne just felt like parents of children should have the right to know when a sex offender is in their area so that they can keep their children safe. Because had she known that a sex offender, a paedophile, was living around that area where Sarah disappeared from, she would have never left her children alone that day. She wouldn't have taken that risk. But she didn't know, and she felt that parents should have the right to know. Sarah was inspired by Megan's Law, which is a law that was introduced in the US in 1996 after the murder of a 7-year-old girl named Megan Kanker. She, like Sarah, was murdered by a man who had previous convictions of sexually assaulting children, and her murder resulted in the creation of Megan's Law, which gave parents of children the right to know about convicted sex offenders living nearby. And Sarah just thought there needs to be a law like that in England to protect children from paedophiles, and so she started a campaign with the help of the News of the World newspaper, and eventually Sarah's Law was introduced. Sarah's Law basically means that parents and carers and guardians are are within their right to ask the police if a convicted sex offender is in their area. Parents are also allowed to ask the police if someone who has contact with their child has any previous criminal convictions. This law has allowed parents to ensure that their children are safe. There is no doubt in my mind that this law has saved lives and will continue to save the lives of children, and I just think it's incredible. This case is so heartbreaking, but it's amazing what Sarah's family have been able to achieve in her name. I actually read Sarah Payne's book about Sarah's death. It's called Sarah Payne, A Mother's Story, and in it she talks about the fight for Sarah's law. It's a really interesting read, so if anyone wants to check it out, I will leave a link to it in the description box. In late 2003, Sarah and Michael Payne welcomed their 5th child into the world. It was a little girl and they named her Ellie. Shortly before Ellie was born though, the two, Michael and Sarah, actually separated. Unfortunately, after Sarah's murder, they just grew apart and they decided that it would be for the best if they just split up. As you can imagine, both of them suffered very badly with depression following the death of their daughter, and Michael Payne struggled a lot with alcoholism, and sadly in 2014, at the age of 45, he passed away in his home alone. Sources say he died from natural causes, but it is believed that his alcohol addiction contributed to his death. Sarah Payne has done so much child protection work over the years, and in the year 2008 she was actually awarded an MBE for everything she has helped to achieve. Unfortunately, Sarah suffered a stroke in 2011, and according to sources she was said to have had a 50-50 chance of survival. It was life-threatening, but thankfully she managed to survive the stroke. Her children are of course all adults now. Well, I believe Ellie would be around 17, but Lee, Luke and Charlotte are all adults. I've watched a couple of interviews with Sarah's siblings, so if you want to watch those, I will leave them linked below. And that is the end of this case. A really heartbreaking one, but I think it's amazing that something so incredible, Sarah's law, has come out of it. Like I said, I have no doubt that the work achieved in Sarah's name will have saved the lives of so many other children. But yeah, that is the end of this video. As usual, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link will always be in the description box of my videos. Please do leave any case suggestions in the comments below, or alternatively, I do have a case request form. Please give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.